Well, let's go ahead and take our seats and get started here. Welcome to the second day of the 2010 AUSA Symposium and the Forum Series that we have put together for professional development. Manning the Army for the 21st Century is going to be the topic of the discussion this morning. We have a great panel put together, and Lieutenant General Bostick, who is the Army G1, and responsible for all of this in some form or another, will go ahead and lead the panel. So I want to thank the panel members for having participated with us here. And your job out there is to listen, find questions that you have to have answered, and ask those questions before you finish. Nobody should leave here with a question they didn't want to have answered. Thank you.
AUSA, thank you very much. And on behalf of Mr. Lamont, our Assistant Secretary for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, who couldn't be here today, and my fellow colleagues on the panel, I want to welcome you to this session on manning the total Army for the 21st century. You know, I've been working in the personnel arena, even though I didn't grow up as a personnelist, and I've come to really appreciate the hard work and the dedication and the sacrifices of all of those in this part of the Army. I've learned that on some days you're everyone's best friend, and on other days you're their worst enemy, and this phenomenon could sometimes occur simultaneously with the same person. But it is a great honor to work in this area and to be here with the other folks on the panel. Creighton Abrams probably said it best when he said, people are not in the Army, they are the Army. And you know, you can buy and purchase and repair equipment, move it around any time of the day or year, but people talk. They talk back, not in a negative way, but they have feelings, they have aspirations, they have families, they have desires, and then you have to work with people, understand their issues, challenges, and concerns in the context of the overall Army requirements. So it's a great honor to be here today to talk about soldiers, our great civilians, their wonderful families that support them in this day of great challenge. And I also want to introduce my fellow teammates up here. We have representing the MNRA, Mr. Sam Rutherford to my right, and he'll talk about the SecDef efficiencies, the announcement that the SecDef made in several speeches dating back till May, and the ongoing work that we've had within the Army to do the efficiencies work in the personnel arena. I'll then follow him and talk about the temporary end strength increase. Some of you may have heard the Chief talk about that this morning, but I'll give you an update on where we're at with that, talk a little bit about the challenges that we had that led into the requirement to have a temporary end strength increase. Then Major Don Campbell will talk about recruiting and retention. And rumor has it that things improved the day I left recruiting and Don took over. So he's got a lot of good stuff to tell you about it, but real proud of the great work that he has done. We're honored to have Major General Gina Farrisee here. She is now the Commanding General of Human Resource Center, the Human Resources Command, and it's out there at the Center of Excellence for Human Resources out at Fort Knox. And I remember briefing the Chief about several months ago, and I said, sir, it's getting ready to happen. HRC is leaving the Hoffman buildings and moving to Knox. And he said, really? Is it really gonna? Sir, it's really gonna happen, and it has happened. Major General Sean Byrne and his team did a great job of taking it out, and then Gina Farrisee has been in command in the saddle and doing a great job, and she's gonna talk about manning the force. She comes with a huge amount of background experience from coming just out of the building, working a lot of manning issues for the Chief, Secretary, and the Vice. Ray Carpenter from the National Guard will talk about the National Guard total force policy and a number of other related issues that make the National Guard and the Army Reserves an operational reserve and a key part and component and an essential part of the Army team, the total team. And you'll see that they are linked in with our 4Gen, and really the Army Force Generation model could not happen without the National Guard and the Army Reserves. And Leslie Purser will talk about the IRR and the assured access to the reserves. And finally, some real exciting work, last but not least, certainly, is the great work that's ongoing for the civilian workforce transformation. And Joe McDade will talk about that, but it's really a total Army effort about the future of our civilian workforce and what we need to do to make a great workforce even better. So before we begin, and I've asked each one of the panelists to just talk briefly and introduce their area, and then let the audience kind of drive the discussion. So if you don't have any questions, we'll be leaving shortly after their 5-minute intros, but we didn't want a lot of long discussions because we have so many panelists, and we really wanted to speak to the issues of concern of the audience. So I'll just open it up and give you a feel before Sam starts of kind of what we're in the Manning arena. And the Chief has talked about it a bit this morning, but you know, we're in 9 years of war. We're operating in 9 years of war. Our soldiers, our civilians, our families that support them are under a significant amount of stress. And all of the negative kind of indicators that one might look at are unfortunately up, whether it's suicides, sexual harassment and assault, spouse abuse, child abuse, alcohol and drug abuse. Sadly, those numbers have increased. In suicides alone, last year we had 163 active duty suicides. The year before that, 142. And if you go back to 2001, we had 52 suicides. So we're looking at that and working with the best specialists across the country, working within our Army to sort out how do we reduce the stress on the force. And it's, as the Chief has often talked to us, we have 4 imperatives to help drive the Army. And the first is to sustain the all-volunteer force. And we do that by caring for our soldiers, our families, and the civilians that support them. We have to prepare them for the conflicts that they will be engaged in, that they're currently engaged in, and those in the future. And when they return, reset them, get them ready for the next thing that's coming down for the Army as a commitment. And finally, to transform for an uncertain future. But in all of those 4 priorities, the Chief has focused us on sustaining the all-volunteer force. And key amongst that, in order to reduce stress on the force, the number one factor to reduce stress is to increase the dwell, increase the time at home that our soldiers and our families have to recover. And we've done a number of studies and believe that it's going to take 2 to 3 years for a soldier and family to really recover from a 1-year deployment. So we want to talk about that. Our Army is engaged in all of those areas, but people is what the Army is all about, and we're very fortunate to have some of the experts in this arena to talk to you about these key important people areas. So I'm going to turn it over to Sam Rutherford.
Thanks, sir. On behalf of Mr. Lamont, it is a pleasure to be here. I think this is truly an historic period in our history with regard to the all-volunteer force. And I think after many years of war, all of us believe and know that the all-volunteer force is a great success. And it was only a few years ago, if some of you remember, that there were members of Congress and the public talking about a draft. So how did we get here? How did the playbook didn't say that this should happen. In fact, the playbook said that to fight globally in a protracted war, there would have to be partial mobilization, followed by full mobilization, total mobilization, and conscription. And yet, here we are today with a magnificent, educated, experienced, and committed all-volunteer force. How did it happen? You know the many things that happened over the last 9 years. The economy has an impact, but it wasn't the most significant impact. And I just want to mention, before I talk about some of the efficiencies that they're looking at, mention some of the examples that were accomplished over the last 9 years to make the all-volunteer force a possibility. Key is, I think you know that we restored the competitive compensation in the military. If you recall, the targeted pay raises of 2001 through 2007 brought military compensation to that 70th percentile, which was recommended by the 9th QRMC. Indeed, today, along with increases in BAS and other pays, total military compensation is roughly at the 80th percentile, and much higher than that for our junior soldiers. So that was a significant part in the success of the all-volunteer force, but this is truly an ongoing effort. Some of you may know that the quadrennial review of compensation, the 11th one, is currently in session now, and they have some very, very tough issues they're looking at, and that report is forthcoming. Just a few of the things they're looking at compensation performed in a combat zone or in a hostile area, whether that's correct. They're looking at Reserve and National Guard compensation and benefits consistent with how they're utilized now and how they are utilized in the future, and that's very significant. And they're also looking at compensation where we've made great improvement to wounded warriors, caregivers, survivors, and those critical field such as mental health professionals, linguists, translators, remotely piloted vehicles, those areas, in addition to special ops. So we'll probably get a lot of good information out of the 11th QRMC soon, which will guide compensation in the future, which is key to the all-volunteer force, along with many other programs. The department also, and you can't understate this, implemented the most comprehensive reform of the GI Bill, which most of you are very well aware of. The features of it are just huge. 36 months tuition, stipend for living, and transferability. What some of you may not realize is when that proposal came from Congress, we were very concerned about the transferability part, which we thought at the time would encourage members to separate, to take advantage of that education opportunity. In fact, the opposite has occurred. Transferability has proven just to be a very significant lever in retention, where members actually stay on longer for that transferability option. So it is huge. It is huge for the Army, and it's huge for the nation. Also, in the last several years, we've opened several new doors. Lateral accessions to senior grades, not senior grades, but mid-grades. We've had age waivers for sessions. There were programs to assess individuals with special skills, languages, cultural skills. And there's the MAVNI program, which most of you are probably aware, which assesses those with health profession skills who are not citizens. So we've done a lot of creative thinking. We've opened a lot of doors. We're really focused on doing the right things to promote the all-volunteer force and to make it the success that it is. But the Army has also responded to changes in the environment and organizations. I could cite all kinds of examples how manning the force, how human resource management has changed over the last 9 years, whether it was HR policy or family service programs. The changes really have been unprecedented. But as the Sec Army said yesterday, we must relook the old and revisit all the new ideas, because the hard work is not done yet. And there were several forums in yesterday's session on family programs, and they're all very key to manning the force, and they have to be sustained, and we have to see what the next challenge is. There is much more, but with regard to the operational efficiencies, as many of you probably know, on 28 September, the Senate Armed Services Committee had a hearing to receive testimony on efficiencies. And the Deputy Secretary, Secretary Lynn, and many others were in that hearing. The committee was very supportive and appreciated the direction of the Department of Defense to eliminate waste and identify efficiencies in billions of dollars in savings without impacting the strength of the force. That means those efficiencies, those savings are transferred over and fund the force, so the force will not decrease in size and capability. The Senate specifically mentioned looking at service contracts and increasing healthcare costs, not increasing healthcare costs, as areas where the department can identify several cost savings. And so those are being looked at also at this time. The most likely outcome is that the congressional members will continue to remind the department that they are key stakeholders in decisions regarding efficiencies inside the department. But let me say that we're frequently reminded of the need to look at efficiencies. And if you were at the opening ceremony yesterday, you heard the Secretary of the Army talk to this. It's going to be looked at very hard, and it's not something that we will look at and then it will be over and complete. It's an ongoing effort over the next several years. And it's essential because we're at war and we have to operate within constrained resources in the next several years to come. And it's just the right thing to do to continue to look for those savings. When the Secretary of Defense made his comments earlier this year, his message was very clear, and we're continuing down that path. And I just want to share some bullet comments to put this in context for you. With regard to Secretary of Defense efficiencies, implementation of efficiency reductions is an ongoing action aligned with POM 1216 and subject to non-disclosure. Keep in mind that the comments are all pre-decisional at this time. On May 10th, the SecDef directed the services to shift resources from overhead to increase funding for force structure and weapons accounts. The Army targets are $28 billion over the POM. The Army has several forums ongoing right now to explore how we will achieve the $28 billion to be realigned, to include a review of all service contracts, business process efficiencies, acquisition reform initiatives, and implementing efficiencies in IT and management, to include training management, and the reductions of the number of reports, studies, boards, and commissions that are currently in existence. The Vice is leading both material and non-material CPRs, capability portfolio reviews, to identify redundancies and to divest of systems or capabilities that are no longer needed. These CPRs are ongoing right now, and they've been enlightening in terms of the number of redundant capabilities in weapon systems that are no longer needed on the battlefield of today. And also they have identified several business practices that really should be changed to support current decision-making processes. And the Army, lastly, is utilizing the experience of many of our graybeards to help shape the programs to better serve soldiers and shape our warfighting strategy. Many of you know that General Franks just completed a very comprehensive review of non-deployables, the medical processing and the physical evaluation board process with recommendations that will result in streamlined processes. And General Reimer's study on the utilization of the reserve component in an era of persistent conflict will also shape and operationalize the reserve component. So that is where we're headed. What is discussed here today will not be easy to achieve, but we're confident that we'll achieve our goals, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Gina?
Okay, thank you, Sam. Next, I wanted to talk about non-deployables and our situation with that, and some other factors that led the Chief and the Secretary to go to the SecDef and ask for a temporary end strength increase, where we stand with that. And then Don will talk about how we're recruiting against those numbers, and then Gina will talk about the manning of the units with that increase. First, the non-deployable situation has increased dramatically over the last several years. If you looked at a brigade combat team in 07, 3,800 or so in a team, depending on which type of brigade combat team you're looking at. We'd have about 390 that were non-deployable. At the time, they had to arrive, the latest arrival date in unit, which we call LAD. So in 08, that grew to 465. In 09, it grew to 500. And in 10, it was 570. So today, percentage-wise of a brigade combat team, we're running about 14.5%. We in 12, when we're trying to get to 1 to 2, the R4 Gen deployed for 1 year, 2 years of dwell, we believe that the non-deployable rate will be about 16% or so. We don't want it to grow, but the reality is we're tracking what's happening with our soldiers, and we're making our best assumptions and assessment on what could happen in the future. The biggest challenge is in medical. In medical arena, some of it is temporary medical, where we fix the soldiers. They're not ready to go at the deployment time, but we're able to fix the kind of injuries. About 68% of them are musculoskeletal type issues that they're having, knees and backs and muscles. Some of that is temporary, some of it's longer term, but it's something that we've got to deal with and continue to work. The other factor is wounded warriors. We thought that number was actually going to start coming down this year, but with what's happened in Afghanistan, the number's going the other direction. So we are at about 9,000 wounded warriors when you add the active duty and the reserve component together. The other thing we're dealing with is individual augmentees. And these are the soldiers that are taken out of units like TRADOC, the Pentagon, and all of the generating force that the Secretary talked about today. And that number's just under 6,000. We think it's going to dip down with what's happening in Iraq, but we're planning into the future about 5,000 individual augmentees. And these are 5,000 non-commissioned officers and officers that have jobs in other locations that we are going to pull them to meet the requirements in a deployed theater. The other thing that affected us was stop loss. And the SecDef said to stop doing stop loss. So we did, and we have to make up for those losses. And right now, it's a little over 4,000 that we had to make up, and it usually is 3 to 1. So you got to plan on 12,000 soldiers to make up for 4,000, because a soldier, let's say he's on a 4-year enlistment, and at about the 3.5-year point, his unit's going to deploy, and he's got to have 6 or more months to deploy. So if he's at the 5-month point, then we can't stop loss him, so he stays in that unit. Some folks affectionately call them ice cubes, and they melt away. But they're on our books, and we have an end strength, so we can't recruit against them. So you have to find a way to have 3 to 1, about 12,000 soldiers to make up for 4,000 that might be stop loss. So I'm prepared to talk about all of those areas, but I just wanted to introduce the topic of non-deployables. It's a huge issue that we are working across the Army that we've got to fix, and there's a number of ways to go at it, and we can talk about those. All of that helped to lead into a temporary end strength increase request. So the Secretary of Defense approved a growth of 22,000. He approved it in increments. First, we were able to grow 5,000 in 2009, and thanks to the great work of Don Campbell and his team, given only a couple of months in 2009, we were able to grow 5,000 of the 22. And then we grew another 10,000 in last year. So we're at 15,000 of the 22. And we had a real tough decision to make. Now how many think how many think if you had 15,000, you got to grow to 22? How many would grow to 22? Okay, how many would not? You got to have a vote. The numbers got to add up. I mean, you got to do it or not do it. But anyway, that was our challenge. Do you grow or do you not grow? Because on the other end of this, if you're in the people business, we have to be down, so we could grow to 569.4, but we have to be at 547.4 in September 13. So there's a ramp down. And we've got to come down to 547.4 by September 13. So it's how much do you need, given the assumptions that you have, so that you don't grow too large, so that you have to tell folks that you want to keep and that want to stay, that we can no longer have you in the Army. That's the tough call, and we have to balance that. From an operator point of view, grow it as quickly as you can, keep it as long as you can. And from a personnel point of view, you got to care for soldiers and families and treat them with dignity and respect. But that's our charter. We are fairly close to growing the Army out to 569.4. We'll hold it and ramp down by September 13. And I'm prepared to talk about those two topics as we move on. So I'll turn that over then to Don about how he's doing with recruiting.
Sir, thank you. It's an honor to be here today and represent my boss, Lieutenant General Ben Frakely, the commander of a Sessions Command, headquartered at Fort Knox, was at Monroe. He wanted me to make sure I got this point across, that 100% of the command has moved to Fort Knox. And he's responsible, we are responsible for obviously enlisted warrant officer and officer accessions. In my position is the recruiting CG. My partner, Art Bartell, who we're getting ready to deploy. Mark McDonald will come in and command Cadet Command. And then our accession support brigade, which obviously supports our efforts in both categories across the country. If I could get, I'm a tanker. I'm an armor officer by trade, or I guess I was, so I have to show slides. I'm not quite as good as General Bostick. I got to tell you though, when I took command from General Bostick, he set the conditions for us to be very successful. And my guys immediately brought in a bunch of notes and said, sir, these are all the things that the G1 of the Army disapproved. So we've been running them back up the train.
True story.
So I keep running some of those up, sir. But in all seriousness, if I could get slide, I think it's slide 10. I just wanted to show you what, no, go to 10. One more. Thank you. This is what Fort Knox looks like today. Now, I previously commanded the Armor Center in Fort Knox. Funny story is I was living in my boss's house. It's 7,000 square feet. We went to 3,000 when I moved out, so I give him a hard time about that all the time. But this is Fort Knox. Human resource, I imagine in the future, will be redesignated to human capital. I want to make it very clear that Gina Farcy commands HRC. She's part of that enterprise, but she doesn't work directly for my boss. She reports to General Bostick. Recruiting Command, Cadet Command, you can see what is there now. The Armor School and Center is moving and on its way to Fort Benning under the leadership of my good friend Mike Fairder and the Commandant, now Colonel Promotable Ted Martin. Lots of units, lots of activities. At the end of the day, about 40,000 men and women and family members, a growth of about 5,000. But that's what Fort Knox looks like today from previous, for those, just to kind of set a baseline for you. We work very closely, obviously, with General Farcy and her team in Human Resources Command, General Bostick and his team, Training and Doctrine Command. The Chief of the Army Reserve, Lizzie Purser's boss, she'll speak in a minute about what they're doing on their side. But this year, my boss's guidance to the team, and really to us from an enlisted side, is to focus on making sure that we're doing the best we can to support Army force generation. Now, you're going to say, how does Recruiting Command get into that? A lot of the ways. A lot of it is from a precision standpoint, to make sure that we give the Army those officers and those young soldiers that they require at a certain time, important period. If the world were perfect, my boss would say, the theater commander could say, I need a Farsi speaker of this caliber, of this quality, with this education, and we could deliver that young man or woman to the theater commander in a timely manner, considering basic training and all the other things they have to go through. But that's what we're working hard in a Sessions Command, is to meet the Army requirements in a more timely manner with greater precision, in particular in fiscal year, this year 11 and next year in 12. I don't really lose a lot of sleep on fiscal year 11. On a mission of 67,000, we had an entry pool of 33,276. That's almost 50% of the yearly goal. My focus now is on making sure that we bring the right young man or woman into the Army, which leads me to my next slide real quick. Go back to slide 8. It's actually my first one. I thought I'd show these numbers to you just to give you some perspective. And after 9+ years of an Army at war, if you look at the left-hand side, it shows 2007 and all the marks that we're really looked at, and then on the right-hand side, those are the young men and women in both the Army Reserve and the regular Army, and their basic characteristics as they came in the Army. And I wanted to make sure that we didn't differentiate between the regular Army and the Army Reserve, because we recruit for both sides. 74,577 on the Army active side last year, and 17,046 for General Purser and General Stoltz in the Army Reserve. Quality marks, as you can see, we're held to 90% high school degree, both 99, almost 100% on both sides. 1 to 3 alpha are those young men and women that score top tier of the 50 or above on the ASVAB, Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery Test. 64% and 70% were held to standard 4% or less on category 4, those young men and women that score in the lowest category. Half a percent regular Army and 1.8 Army Reserve. Your Army is, and has been, I would offer, since General Bostick took over, has been on a good incline or glide path up when we talk in terms of those young men and women that are coming in. What's amazing is those young men and women that are coming in, the number one reason they're coming in today is still service. Number one reason. In all the surveys, it is still service to country.